So I'll give you a little title tonight. It's a well-known phrase. It may be well-known to you even more when we've finished our discussion. The expression we're going to look at a little deeper is the field is the world. It's an expression that Jesus uses in Matthew 13. I'll tell you why I've selected this discussion. We are, I suppose, living at an unusual time. And I was just chatting to one of the brothers before the meeting, and I last spoke to him in 73, and we thought the end was going to come very, very close back in 73. And maybe that was the feeling of some of you here tonight. Just to show you that Jehovah and his organization have got everything under control, we're going to just discuss that expression. The field is the world. Let me just introduce it by saying that I've had the subject raised with me. I've had the question asked. I don't know whether you've had it. But people have said to me, aren't Jehovah's Witnesses one of the new religions, one of the modern religions? And aren't you American? You know, didn't get your start in America. And you know how quick we are to defend? Oh, no, we're not American. In fact, we can trace our ancestry all the way back to righteous man Abel. He was the first Jehovah's Witness. But what we'd like to highlight tonight, that if someone does say that to you, you're an American religion, or you're only one of these 20th century new religions, don't get embarrassed. Say, well, I'm ever so glad you've noticed that. Yes, we are modern. And it is true. We did get our start in modern times in America, although based on the early concept and precepts of Christianity in the first century. Because you see, the whole point of our discussion is this, that if we were a dominant religion all through time, do you know something? It wouldn't be the truth. Because Jesus indicated at a particular time, the truth would become manifest. He talked about the conclusion being the time of harvesting. And it's only then that we would truly see his organization on the world scene having an effect. Now, what I'd like to do tonight is just look at the account, some call it a parable or the illustration, in Matthew chapter 13. Now, if you'll open the Bible to Matthew 13, we'll do two things. We'll read the account, and then we'll read the explanation that Jesus gives. And what we'd like to do is look at two accounts in the Bible tonight, one from Matthew, and then a little twist in the tail when we look at the way that another Bible prophet didn't know that he was actually prophesying about this event, and yet it's in the Hebrew scriptures, the event that we're going to look at in Matthew 13. I'll show you how in a little while. The first part's easy, and so I can cope with that. The second part, well, you'll have to help me out. So let's look at verse 24. It says in Matthew 13:24, another illustration he set before them, saying, the kingdom of the heavens has become like a man that sowed fine seed in his field. While men were sleeping, his enemy came and oversowed weeds in among the wheat and left. When the blade sprouted and produced fruit, then the weeds appeared also. So the slaves of the householder came up and said to him, Master, did you not sow fine seed in your field? How then does it come to have weeds? He said to them, an enemy, a man did this. They said to him, do you want us then to go out and collect them? He said, no, that by no chance while collecting the weeds, you uproot the wheat with them. So this is what he suggested. Let both grow together until when? The harvest. And in the harvest season, I will tell the reapers, first collect the weeds and bind them in bundles to burn them up. Then go to gathering the wheat into my storehouse. Now you've read that before, haven't you? Do you understand it? Just to make it clear, let's see the explanation in verse 36 so that you don't have to raise questions at this stage. He says, then after dismissing crowds, he went into the house, and his disciples came to him and said, explain to us the illustration of the weeds in the field. In response, he said, and you know this, don't you? The sower of the fine seed is none other than the Son of Man. My theme, or the theme for tonight, the field where he sowed the fine seed is the world. And just for those who like things nice and clear, he wasn't talking about the globe as such. He was talking about people of all nations. The Watchtower that I'm taking this from said it was a field of opportunity for people of all nations to become a son of the kingdom. That was the desire of the Son of Man. He said, as for the fine seed, well, these are the sons of the kingdom. The weeds, the sons of the wicked one. The enemy, well, even the young ones know this one, is the devil. And what I said in the introduction, the harvest is a conclusion of a system of things. And who gets it all going and started nicely in the time of the end? It's the reapers, who are angels. So we've got Jesus, we've got people of all nations, we've got some who will become sons of the kingdom, others not, and we've also got a harvest time. Now, I think we all are familiar with the account, but what's so interesting is the development of Jesus Christ's influence on the world scene from the first century in effecting the collecting of the 144,000. That's what it's all about. And where we're concerned, we're also going to be blessed and benefited because of this action. But what I find most stimulating is the battle between Jesus Christ and his desire through natural means to get the work done and the interference of the devil's organization. And you know, when you actually look at the Bible's prophecy, it's absolutely fascinating the way it all takes place. Let's just go back and have a look at the account in verse 24, and let's see if we can go through it a little bit at a time and see whether or not anything there. Say, oh, do you know, that makes me feel good. It says here, the kingdom of the heavens has become like a man that sowed fine seed in his field. Now, we found out that the Son of Man, Jesus Christ, is the man. He's the one who'd come to sow fine seed. And where did we say the field was? Do you remember? The field, was it just Palestine? Was it just Judea? Where was it? It was going to be people of all nations. But he was going to start somewhere, and he started in Judea. Now, you know as well as I do that before a farmer ever plants any seed, he has to prepare the soil, which explains why he started in Judea, because for centuries the Jews had been prepared for the Messiah. We know that because, does anybody remember when John the Baptist appeared on the scene, what did it say that the Jews were in anticipation of? They were in anticipation of the Messiah. And so for that very reason, there was no better place for Jesus to begin locating individuals and giving them an opportunity religiously to eventually become sons of the kingdom. But we did say the field was the world, and even though Jesus said, well, I've got to start here, did he have in mind other nations? Well, yes. In fact, without going too far, if you want to keep your finger there, everybody knows John 4. Do you remember which woman he was speaking of and to in John chapter 4? Do you remember that one? It was the woman of Samaria. Now, Samaritans were not very closely linked with the Jews. They hated one another, almost like the Jews and the Muslims in the Middle East to this day. But the Samaritans, of course, did have a smattering of the scriptures. Do you remember who they were? At one time, Samaria was the 10-tribe kingdom. It was an apostate kingdom, but they held on to certain sections of the scriptures. And even though they were overtaken by the Assyrians and dispersed and intermingled, there were quite a lot of them held to certain sections of the scriptures. They held on to actually the Pentateuch. Does anybody know what was contained in the Pentateuch? Well, look at verse in John chapter 4 and verse 24, 5. We'll look at verse 25, really. It says, the woman said to him, that's the woman at Samaria, said, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. Whenever that one arrives, he will declare all things to us openly. I remember the Watchtower making the statement on the next verse, the first time, and it was to a woman, and she wasn't even a complete Jewish woman. He identified himself as the Messiah. I, who am speaking to you, am he. And if you look across at verse 40, he says, when the Samaritans came to him, they began asking him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days, obviously teaching them, preparing them. So have you got the idea now? We've got him preaching to the Jews, preparing the soil there, but also, remember, preparing the field, because there were other nationalities. Now, when did the first sowing begin? I think you know the answer to that one, don't you? If I said to you, what is the time? You'd answer me straight away. Pentecost. That was the time when he first placed the seed, the kingdom heirs began to grow. And what was so remarkable about that event, I suppose it could only ever happen once in history, and that was that there was a congregation established immediately. How many are in the Kingdom Hall tonight? Do we have a rough idea? Did we do a count? Roughly. Yes, brother, please. 101. Right. Now, if we could have just found 19 more, that would have been nice, wouldn't it? I could have actually said that was the number that made up the very first congregation in Jerusalem. And you know, because of the Holy Spirit, they operated very quickly. They got it right. They had the truth clear, and they wanted to preach. And you know what happened, don't you? Thousands of Jews from possibly 16 other lands, or at least 15 other lands, were in Jerusalem, and they learned the truth at Pentecost, and they associated with that newly established congregation. And you know what happened? When they went back, they were able to copy the style of that first century congregation, and before long, the field was in different countries, 16 countries straight away, and they began to follow the same procedure. And so what you had then is just a field growing with pure wheat and spreading. So much so, it's been said so often that within 26 years of Pentecost, Paul could actually say that the message of the good news had been preached where? In all creation under heaven. Not every single part of the earth, but every part of the Roman world power had congregations operating as we now know them here in Stirling. So I've told you something that you already know. But now the problem, now the little obstacle. What does it say in verse 25? Things got started nicely through the preaching work. It says, while men were sleeping, his enemy came and oversowed weeds in among the wheat and left. When the blade sprouted and produced fruit, then the weeds appeared also. So we'll look at that in a few moments. Let's go through it. So suddenly the devil wants to stop the field becoming the world. He wants to stop the world of all mankind being given an opportunity to become a son of the kingdom. So how does he do it? He sows weeds in the field. Now, what does that mean? Well, for a number of years, we used to believe that it was unfaithful Christians who had become bad, apostate in their thinking, that they were the ones that were really going to stop the field developing. But really, it couldn't have been that, because Jesus actually did use the word not wheat, but he used the word weeds. And weeds have never been wheat. You know that, don't you? Wheat will always be wheat, and Jehovah's immutable law is that everything produces after its own kind. So what must the weeds have been? They must have been weeds from the start. And Jesus was ever so clever, because when he used the expression weeds, I don't understand Greek, so I'm not going to even attempt at discussing it. But the word that he used for weeds was, in English, black darnel, or zizanian in Greek, which actually is a weed that grows very similar to wheat. In fact, you can hardly tell the difference. I was going to say you could hardly see the join, but you could hardly tell the difference between wheat and weeds until when? His knowledge of farming, the harvest. And do you know why? Because, you see, you get the golden ears of corn, but the weeds when it produces its fruitage, it's black and poisonous. And interestingly, a brother was showing me, he worked at one of the universities, he just showed me the Zizanian weed, and he said, notice its roots, and the roots are such that they intertwine around everything that they grow against, which explains, once you began to see the difference, Jesus said, if you pull the weeds out, you know what you're going to do? Disturb the roots of the wheat. And all we're interested in is actually the seed of the wheat at the end, the fruitage. So let them grow together. And then once it's discernible, then we can do something about it. So how did weeds start growing? Well, the Bible says, doesn't it? At the beginning of verse 25, while men were sleeping. Does anybody remember when the Bible talks about sleeping, what does it refer to? Does anybody remember? We've mentioned it tonight in John 5, didn't we, in the discussion. So people can sleep in death. So which ones would that be? Sister Snedden? That's right. So when they died, then these weed-like ones who were poisonous got in the congregation. So it wasn't weak ones going bad. The devil actually planted individuals in. And we know that it was only after the death of the apostles, because when Paul was there acting as a restraint, do you remember what he said to the Ephesians? He said, after my going away, what did he say? Oppressive wolves will try and get in. For what reason? To speak twisted things using the same expression as that of the Zizanian weed and its root, to draw the disciples after themselves. So actually even Paul was using the illustration to describe what was about to happen if he hadn't have warned them. But he did. And so they couldn't get in. And then the other form of sleep is the fact that you can have sleep in death. And if I mention Revelation chapter 16, does anybody know what another form of sleep is? Well, it's sleeping on the job. Sleeping spiritually. When elders became lethargic in caring for their responsibilities in the flock. So you lost the restraint of the apostles, and sadly some of the elders were not as diligent in protecting the flock as they should. And it wasn't long before individuals wormed their way in and introduced ideas like this. If I stood on this platform tonight and I said, as some did in the 2nd and 3rd century, that, do you know something, that everybody who's on this earth, whether good or bad, love God or not, will get a second opportunity and will be given life, whether we preach to them or not. Do you know what that would do to our preaching work? It would negate it, wouldn't it? It's pointless if everybody's going to get life. But maybe they didn't come out quite as bluntly as that. But you know, insidiously, they introduced ideas that were very similar to immortality of the soul. And ideas that people all would be forgiven by God. God looks upon everyone and can forgive anyone. He sees the good in all and will never be adverse in his judgment. And it wasn't long before those ideas affected the congregations. So what you got then was congregations, not just simply with pure truth and wheat-like ones growing, but now you got weed-like. Anybody here got a garden? Have you got a garden? Have you got a garden? Is it nice? Now, if you neglect it for a few weeks, do you know what happens? Weeds appear. And if you don't pull them out, you'll find that weeds will proliferate quicker than anything. Isn't that true? You just go away for a month and have a bit of warmth and a bit of rain. And that's exactly why the illustration is so true, that within a matter of a short period of time, you couldn't see the wheat growing because the weeds had totally overrun the field. It didn't mean they weren't growing. It just meant that the actual preaching activity just simply petered out. Now, how do we know that there would still be wheat-like all through time? Well, the famous phrase, Jesus said, I will be with you, what? All the days until the conclusion. So I'll always be there, So there'll always be a wheat class, but they'd be very difficult to be noticed because of the growth and the outgrowth of the weeds. So it appeared on the surface that because the preaching work came to an end, had the devil thwarted Jesus' actual promise that the field would be the world. And why I want to get to that point quickly is because I find the next little angle that I read in one of our publications. Some of you may not even have read it because it's such an old one. It's called Your Will Be Done. In fact, it came out whilst I was still at school, which gives you some idea. It's a long time since it came out, 1958, 59. We were studying that publication. And what's that got to do with the field is the world? What's that got to do? You got your start in America, you're only a new religion. Everything. Can I just show you something? So the work of preaching came to a standstill, but Jesus promised that by the harvest time, people in all of the earth would be in a position to make a conscious decision either to serve God or not, at least have the scriptures available. And how was it done? Well, if the devil could have only have understood scripture, he would have never have used it, but he did. And he fell for the biggest trap that Jehovah and Jesus laid for him as far as our activity is concerned. Let me turn you to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel 2. And verse 21. And what we're going to do here is just look at the principle of Daniel chapter 2. And let's see how the world became the field to harvest the sons of the kingdom. And we'll begin by looking at verse 21, where it shows that God has this ability. He is changing times and seasons, removing kings and setting up kings. For what reason? Giving wisdom to the wise ones and knowledge to those knowing discernment. And it goes on to talk about the way that God will reveal deep things as a result of this, the changing and the removing of kings and setting up kings. Now, I think all Bible students here tonight know that Jehovah doesn't go around saying, right, now this is the time that we're going to get rid of this particular world power and that. The removing of the kings is the fact that Jehovah can use the movement of kings and the setting up of kings to his advantage. He's done that because we've seen how he's used it to benefit his own people, Israel. So we're going to see how Jehovah uses the kings to allow knowledge to the wise ones. And yet, we thought it was through the preaching work alone that that would be possible. Turn with me to the prophecy that Daniel had in mind in Daniel chapter 7, and let's see how it works. Daniel chapter 7. Now, I don't know whether anybody remembers going through this. Do any of you remember reading this? Or is it a little beyond your time? Okay. Well, let's have a look at verse 2. And this is the one related to Matthew 13. And you'll be wondering, well, how does it equate with Matthew 13? You see how it works. It says, Daniel was speaking up and saying, I happened to be beholding in my visions during the night, and see there, the four winds of the heavens were stirring up the vast sea. And then four huge beasts were coming up out of the sea, each one being different from the others. Well, what does all that mean? Does anybody remember whenever the Bible describes the vast sea being stirred up, to what is it referring? Do you remember, any of you? Sister Mahar, please, just tell me. It does. But in this case, they're being stirred up. They're boisterous. So it can't be Jehovah who's behind it. Who are the four winds? Well, the Your Will Be Done book and subsequent articles have indicated it's got to be demon influence behind people. Because out of the vast sea of humankind, it says there that four huge beasts come out of the sea, and they're all different, these beasts. Now, if we've got a Bible study here tonight, you'll be thinking, whatever has a beast got to do with the field is the world? Well, do you know what a beast is, don't you? You all know what a beast is. Just turn over the page, and we'll just take the beasts as they refer to it in verse 23. It says, this is what he said, verse 23 of chapter 7. As for the fourth beast, then you can see what it is. There is a fourth kingdom that will become to be on the earth, that will be different from all the other kingdoms, and it will devour all the earth and will trample it down and crush it. So we're talking about a fourth beast that's going to have a devastating effect upon the whole of the earth, more so than any other of the beasts. Now let me get you to see how that fits in with Matthew 13. The fourth beast from the time of Daniel. Now there have been 7 major world powers that have interested God's people. We've called that the March of the World Powers. By the way, you know that there's been more than 7 world powers in history, but 7 that are of interest to God's people. But we're looking at 4 from the time of Daniel. Who can tell me which power, first of all, was in authority during Daniel's time? Do you remember number 1? Number 1. Can you just tell me which one it was? Sister, please. And there was another one during the time of Daniel towards the latter part of his life. So what was beast 2 or kingdom 2? Brother Simpson. Right. So which one would be beast 3? Brother Jennings. So therefore, which is beast 4? Right. You're all saying it, Rome. Now, let me ask you the question now. What's that got to do with Matthew 13? Now, which power, which beast, which kingdom had just started its rule when Jesus gave the prophecy, the field is the world? The Roman world power had only started 30 years before the birth of Jesus. Did you know that? I know in 55 BCE they were marching through England. Did they come to Stirling, the Romans? Oh, I'm sure they did. Oh, I would. I would come if I was from Rome. I'll talk to you later, Sister Brooks. Yeah. Okay, we'll have our little chat then. Okay. What I'm saying is that that beast got its authority just before Jesus gave the prophecy. So actually, when Daniel starts referring to this fourth beast, guess whose time period he's talking about? The time of Jesus. And what's going to happen after the time of Jesus? And I've never connected it before. You suddenly realize there's a very close connection. And what Jesus Christ does, he uses the Roman beast to do something that the preaching work was unable to do because of the prophecy in Matthew 13. Let's see how it works in verse 24. It says, and as for 10 horns, now everybody knows it's at the beginning of the Revelation book that whenever 10 is mentioned in the Bible, it's talking about the complete control of something, isn't it? The earthly control. So the Roman beast, the Roman kingdom, controlled the earth. As for the 10 horns, out of that kingdom, there were 10 kings, the same point. And then it begins to get specific. It says that will rise up, and still, it says, another one will rise up after them. Now, who are them? Well, he himself will be different from the first ones, and 3 kings he will humiliate. So of all the different kingdoms that have developed from the Roman world power, it's interesting. Did you know that all the world powers subsequently that have followed Rome have copied the style of the Roman kingdom? In other words, the American power has a Senate like the Roman power. A Caesar, you see, like the Germanic world power. So in other words, you find in all the kingdoms that have emerged from the Roman fourth beast of Daniel's prophecy, you've got beasts that are just like Rome. So to that degree, the Roman beast has a world influence even to this day. But who are the 4? Who are the 3? And who is the one that humiliates the 3? Well, it's interesting when you look at history, and today there's a very easy way of proving it. The 3 major beasts that have been affecting the world over the centuries, and then the one that humiliates those 3 are recognized so well. If you've been reading the 15th magazine of each watchtower, how the Bible came to us through the centuries, these three nationalities dominate. For example, let's take number one, mentioned in the Your Will Be Done book. The first one is Spain. The second one was France. The third one was Holland. And the one that humiliated all three, you know it, yeah, the British Empire. And they all had an effect upon the world scene. Maybe not today, but they did through the dark centuries when the preaching work ceased to have the effect of getting the scriptures into the hands of the people, because the preaching work almost came to a full stop. But how? Could I just ask you, does anybody have any idea, besides Mallorca and Minorca and Spain, where do they speak Spanish? Any ideas over the years? Brother Wallace, tell me one.
All
Except one. And you can, if you speak Portuguese, you can understand Spanish. So what a continent. Can you imagine all those millions of people are basically Spanish? Anywhere else? Can you think of any other parts of the world where Spanish is the dominant language? Can you tell me, Brother Snedden? Yeah, well, you might as well say all of Central America, Guatemala, all that whole continent is Spanish-based, even to the southern tips of America, where all around Texas and California, it is Spanish-based. It's not just new. It goes back centuries. Now, there are other places as well. I never realized that Iceland understands the Spanish language. Wish it was just warm, but it isn't. And then you've got places like Egypt and Ethiopia, West Africa, have got Spanish influence. But what's that got to do with the field is the world? Well, let me just ask you. You know, when the Spaniards subjected all of these nations, they took with them their armies, they took with them their political beliefs, they took them also with their culture. But does anybody else know what they took? Ah, you do, don't you, sister? Their religion. It wasn't the truth. It had weed-like doctrines, but they took the Bible into the lands of people, and Jehovah saw to it that the Bible was kept alive and people were given an opportunity. Did you know that when they took the Bible, even in the 13th and the 12th century, into these lands, it contained God's name, Jehovah? It contained the truth about the fact that Jesus Christ died on a stake and that he wasn't a Trinity. It was only perversions later that dissected that belief and tried to change it. And so suddenly, through that one move of a king that's controlled by Satan the devil, and he goes and takes the scriptures into that land for Jesus Christ. If he'd have only known, he'd have said, no way are the Spaniards going to do it, because they actually are strongly religious. And then France took over. By the way, besides France, where else do you speak French? I've got the countries here. I got them from a geography book of the Middle Centuries. Do you know where else they speak French besides? Yes, sister, please. Algeria. I've got, yeah, French West Africa. I'm ever so, well, all right, well, near enough. Okay. Yes, sister, please. That's right. Yeah, you've got, it wasn't called Canada, but I know what you mean. And sister, please. Yes, all round there. Yes. And what about it? Argentina. Argentina. Do they speak, I think the Spanish down there, isn't it? Do they speak a bit of French? I'm sure somebody from France has been. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm ever so pleased if they have. I hope they have. Yeah. Well, do you know, where else is France spoken? Do you know, Brother Wallace? Yeah, most of Africa has, I mean, you places like Zaire. Yeah. Do you want to do the talk for me? Okay, very good. All right, lovely. But it's true, isn't it? And you see, when the French took their armies there, and they took their political beliefs, they took their culture, they took their businesses, they took their families. What did they take with them? Their religion and scripture. And so people, once again, didn't get the truth, and you'll see in a few moments. And then Holland, I mean, we don't think anything more of Holland today than growing bulbs and getting your flowers. I mean, you see all the vans come over with Dutch flowers, isn't it, plants. But you know, at one time, it was a major force in the world. How do we know? Well, where is Dutch spoken besides Holland? Ah, that's easy, isn't it? Brother, please. The West Indies. Yes, I've got the West Indies very much. In fact, the East Indies especially, all round Sumatra, Java, Borneo, all of that is actually Dutch origin. And where else? One major continent, sister? Yes, South Africa. And there are one or two other places as well. But using the same principle, which is actually Jesus has used. I know they'd take their armies, I know they'd take their political ideals, I know they would take their culture, but what else did they take with them? Their religious beliefs and scripture. And just to make sure the whole earth was going to be given an opportunity, what did they say of the British Empire? The sun never set. Do you remember being taught that at school? Yeah, it's in the Proclaimer's book as well. Which meant a quarter of the earth's population and a quarter of the earth's surface was actually controlled by the British with their famous Royal Navy. Where did they speak English besides Sterling? You tell me. Proper English I'm talking about. Well, the list is as long as your arm. Africa would be included, Sri Lanka as it was called, Ceylon, India, China, Russia. It became known as North America. What did the Brits take with them? They did take with them, didn't they? Their Bible. And so, you suddenly find that throughout the whole of the earth, people have got scriptures. That doesn't mean they've got the truth. And the field is the world, so Jesus wants the world and all nations to have an opportunity. Now, there was going to be a right time and the right place. The harvest time was when the truth would be manifest, but there were lots of people looking for the truth. I just went through the Proclaimer's book, and I just found the little expressions concerning just one man back in the 1733, Sir Isaac Newton. Incredible, this man. Again, if he'd been born at the right time, who knows what he could have been and where he'd have been. But he was recognized by many as one of the greatest scientists ever to walk this earth. I mean, I used to think that he just had an apple fall on his head, but he was a very clever man. But you know what he was really known for? The Watchtower made the statement, his love for God's name, Jehovah. And this is what it says in the Proclaimer's book. He was interested in the book of Daniel and the Apocalypse of St. John, he called it. And he said, I really would honestly say, this is in one of his books, written over 250 years ago, that both the prophecies of Daniel and John will only be understood properly in the time of the end. Because even Daniel said, many will run to and fro, and it's then that knowledge will be increased. And it's at that time that the gospel will be preached in all the nations before the greatest tribulation will occur at the end of the world. And it goes on and on and on. And in the same article in the Proclaimer's book, it mentions that Isaac Newton rejected the doctrine of the Trinity. He could give scriptural and historical reasons for doing so. Incredible, isn't it? So there were people who actually had the Bible available to them. And we've had Wycliffe and Tyndale, the Lollards, John Huss, all these individuals who, when they read the scriptures, were so impressed. Now, whether they were of the anointed or not, that's not my place to say. But what I do know is, it was as a result of what we've been reading in Daniel that that opportunity was made available. But why America? Why America? Does anybody know what happened to the Lollards, the mumblers of prayer, when they began preaching the gospel of the good news? And they surrounded Europe with it, you know. They filled Europe with their teaching, but the Catholic Church hated them and persecuted them. And as it did with other groups, it tried to kill and squash them. And then people began to get a bit more adventurous. I was telling the brothers the other day, just a little while ago, I was sitting in a kingdom hall in Lincolnshire, my hometown, really, my home county anyway, 12 miles from my hometown of Scunthorpe, a little town called Gainsborough. In fact, your last circuit overseer's wife, Elizabeth, comes from there, or a family are there. And next door to the Kingdom Hall is the Pilgrim House. And for 50 pence, you can sit in a seat where the pilgrims first met. They travelled down the Trent, they sailed round to Plymouth Hoe and met others who were truly under pressure and wanted to practice their beliefs in God without any restrictions from the church. And you know where they sailed to? To the New World. The New World. Now, why did they go there? Where did all these people suddenly go there? Because there was suddenly tolerance. There was freedom. In fact, it's interesting that, did you know that the pilgrims and the fathers refused to use the King James Bible because they realized it had been tampered with? They wanted a Bible that was absolutely honest. They rejected the Trinity. They rejected the immortality of the soul. They believed in Jehovah. They wouldn't celebrate Christmas or birthdays. In fact, they arrived in the New World on the 25th of December, and to them it was just another day. And so it was the case with folks from South America. So it was the case for folks from North America, from other parts of the earth. They suddenly converge on a land of tolerance, where they could practice what they believed. And then as we approached the harvest time, the time of the end, then Jehovah had to do something to fulfill the prophecy. But people had been given an opportunity. Have we got anybody about 19? They're all a bit embarrassed. Are you, yes, young brother Jennings. Mark, isn't it? You're 19. You all know Mark, don't you? You can't fail to know Mark. He's a nice lad. He read so beautifully tonight. Well, a year younger than Mark, Jehovah did something to a young man by the name of Charles Taze Russell. At 18 years of age, he got hold of a Bible. And he loved it. It was made available because of what we've discussed tonight. And he happened to be the right man at the right time. He was in the right place. It could have been Isaac Newton, but it wasn't, because he lived too soon. How do we know? Well, this is what Charles Taze Russell said concerning his interest in the Bible. He just mentioned, he said, our work was simply to bring together the long scattered fragments of truth that had been revealed over the centuries from the angles that we've been talking about tonight, to present them to the Lord's people, not as our own, not as something new, but this is the Lord's work. We disclaim any credit for the finding and the rearrangement of jewels of truth. Interesting, isn't it? He realized he was just the instrument, the tool. He went on in the Proclaimer's book to say that all that we did was to revive the great truths taught by Jesus and the apostles and turn the light of the 20th century upon them. We had no special revelation from God. It just happened to be God's time for the Bible to be understood. That's humility, isn't it? And you suddenly realize, as we say at the assembly, there was no panic in heaven as a result of the apostasy and the weeds getting in. And even though the preaching work came to its conclusion in the 2nd or maybe 3rd century as far as we know it, Christ had everything under control so that when it was the right time, he used the nations to get the Bible. And when it was the right time, he chose the right place. Why America? Well, because you see, the field isn't Palestine, isn't Judea, isn't Scotland or England. Where is the field? The world. It could be any nation. But you see, if you're going to start harvesting, do you harvest a crop that's nearly ready, or do you harvest a crop that is ready? What would you do? What would you do? Wait till it's ripe. And where was the place ripe for harvesting? The place that was tolerant to the Bible, to the truth. And that's where we've always had freedom. And that's the reason why Pastor Russell said that for the first 5 years of his studying the scriptures, this is what he said: I spent the first 5 years unlearning the many cherished errors, getting rid of them out of his thinking. And then Jehovah used him and his assets to get things going. In fact, he actually wasn't even on the earth when the harvest really began, but he was used by Jehovah and those with him to prepare for the harvest. Because if you go back to Matthew chapter 13 in conclusion, verse 30 says, let both grow together until the harvest. Now we know that sometime, looking back, that the harvest time has to be after sometime 1914. More likely about the year 1919. That's when Christ really did harvest the anointed. And how long did it take to harvest them? Well, by 1935, 16 years later on, he could safely say, I found every one of the 144,000. I was just saying, just 2 weeks ago in the Watchtower, it said that the genuine anointed, was the phrase in the Watchtower, the genuine ones are now all well along in years. I know 8,000 are partakers, but we leave that to Jehovah to find out who are the genuine. If there's 8,000 and we don't think that everyone, well, that's up to Jehovah, but there cannot be many left. He said that's the reason why the end has got to come, for their sake, because they've got to be alive for the days to be cut short. And if we've gone 62 years on into finding the rest of the great crowd, you can understand why we believe the end is near. And that's why it said, at that harvest time, I will tell the reapers. Remember who they were? Who got it all started? It wasn't Pastor Russell. It was the angels. First collect the weeds and bind them in bundles to burn them up. Then go to gathering the wheat into my storehouse. And it's true, the wheat class began to be gathered as a result of the binding of the weeds into bundles, which meant you knew who had the truth. You saw the difference. You knew who had Jehovah's blessing. And from that time on, we've seen the tremendous work God's organization has accomplished. So can you see why, even though we go out and not everybody listens, very few listen anymore, it doesn't worry Jesus Christ, because he's accomplished what he set out to do. I want to give people an opportunity. Whether people choose it or not, I'll give them an opportunity. And doesn't that give you confidence and strengthens your faith that Jehovah God and his son Jesus will accomplish at the right time the work that he actually set out 2,000 years ago? So I just hope that those few scriptural points will help you to appreciate what a joy it is to be a part of an organization that really is totally controlled by Jesus Christ. It knows exactly where it is and where it's going and where it is in the stream of time.